The death struggle of the Sixth Army, which began in the last days of 1942, is a story of unprecedented suffering and death of German soldiers. Here there was despair and understandable bitterness of people whose trust was deceived. But even more the courageous firmness of these people before the undeservedly heavy but inevitable fate, their selfless bravery, unswerving loyalty to duty and sense of combat camaraderie, self-sacrifice and humility before God. I will not talk about all this, not because we, being in the headquarters of the Army Group, did not feel in the depths of our souls all that the Sixth Army had to endure, or at the unparalleled heroism does not allow me to find words really worthy of all this. But I feel obliged to answer one question, and it is I, as former commander of Army Group Don, who must answer it. It is the question of how long it was possible and necessary to require our brave soldiers to fight this unbearably hard, deadly battle. It is the question of whether the final battles of the Sixth Army made sense. The answer to this question must be given not on the basis of the fact that the war was still subsequently lost by us in the end, but on the basis of an assessment of the operational situation prevailing at the time and the imperatives arising from it. On December 26, the commander of the Sixth Army transmitted to us the following report, which the Army Group Command immediately transmitted to the OK, because it constantly fully informed the OK about the situation of the Sixth Army without any embellishment. But by this time we ourselves were receiving reports on the situation in the cauldron only by radio or through individual officers sent from the Sixth Army. Communication on decimeter waves, through which for a time it was possible to conduct radiotelegraphic negotiations, was soon broken again. A report from Colonel General Paulus stated, "Heavy casualties, frost and inadequate supply have lately greatly reduced the combat effectiveness of the divisions. I am therefore compelled to report the following. 1. The Army will be able to continue to repel attacks by small enemy forces and for some time to eliminate critical positions in some areas. A prerequisite for this is improved supply and airlift of replenishment. 2. If the Russians remove large forces from General Gotek's front and, with the help of these and other forces, launch a massive attack on the fortified area, it will not be possible to hold it for a long time. 3. The breakthrough of the Army is not feasible unless a corridor is broken through, and the personnel and supplies of the Army are replenished before that. Therefore, I ask your intercession to the General Command that vigorous measures be taken to unblock the Army, unless the overall operational situation does not require sacrificing it. It goes without saying that the Army will hold on until the last possible opportunity." In addition, the Army reported, "Today, only 70 tons of supplies were airlifted. Bread stocks will run out tomorrow, fat stocks. Tonight, dinner rations for some corps will run out tomorrow. It is urgent to take the most effective measures." This report shows that the opinion expressed 8 days earlier by the Chief of Army Staff that the Army could hold out in the cauldron with adequate supplies until Easter turned out to be wrong, as one would expect. At the same time, this report showed that 8 days ago, when the Army Group Command gave the Sixth Army the order to break through, it was not only the first, but was the state of its forces showed the last chance for salvation. Otherwise, in late December and early January on the fronts of the Sixth Army was relatively calm, except for individual attacks of the enemy. Either the enemy wanted to replenish the ammunition of his artillery before the decisive offensive, or he was concentrating all available forces to destroy the 4th Tank Army and achieve decisive success in the large bend of the Don. January 8, General Hube, commander of 14 TK, arrived at Army Group headquarters. Hitler summoned him to him in Letzen from Stalingrad to get information about the situation in the Sixth Army through him. General Hube informed me that he depicted to Hitler the situation in the cauldron without any embellishments. Hitler had an idea of the situation thanks to the daily reports of the Army Group, but he simply did not want to believe it all. It was remarkable, however, what an impression made on General Hube's stay in Letzen, what effect Hitler's confidence in the rescue of the Sixth Army had on him, although it is not known whether this confidence was sincere or ostentatious. Hitler assured him that everything would be done to ensure that the army for a long time to provide everything necessary, and pointed to the planned deblocking of the army. Hube returned to the cauldron brimming with confidence. But then, on Hitler's orders, he was again summoned from the cauldron and was assigned to direct the supply of the Sixth Army from outside. But even he could not improve the cause of supply, because the shortcomings of supply were caused by adverse weather conditions and lack of transport planes, not by poor organization. I was personally unpleasantly affected by Hube's report that there was a rumor among the soldiers of the Sixth Army that I had told them on the radio, "Hold on, I'll bail you out." Although I made every effort to save the Sixth Army, I was never in the habit of making promises to the troops, in the fulfillment of which I was not sure and whose realization depended not only on me. General Hube, who was a man who knew no fear, during his report to Hitler also tried to make him realize to what extent events like the encirclement of the Sixth Army could damage his authority as head of state. In doing so, he wanted to hint to Hitler that he should have placed command, at least on the Eastern Front, in the hands of a specialist, a military man. But since Hube was with us on the way to Letzen, Hitler undoubtedly suspected that it was I who made Hube express such thoughts, although it was not so. When later, after the fall of Stalingrad, I proposed to Hitler to appoint a supreme commander-in-chief, he had already been warned and took it absolutely negatively. Perhaps in another case, he would rather have gone for what I proposed, because the death of the Sixth Army, the responsibility for which lay on him, strongly affected him. On January 9, the enemy offered the Sixth Army to surrender. On Hitler's orders, this proposal was rejected. I do not think that I can be accused of being uncritical of Hitler's military decisions and activities, but in this case I fully support his decision, because at that moment it was dictated by necessity, no matter how difficult it was from a purely human point of view. I do not say that, in the view of a true soldier, an army has no right to surrender while it is still at least somewhat capable of fighting. To deny this view would be to deny the basic principles of warfare altogether. Until the happy age comes when nations can do without armed forces as long as soldiers exist, it will be necessary to defend this view as the view of soldierly honor. Even the seeming futility of a battle that can be avoided by surrender does not in itself at all justify the surrender of troops. If every commander who considered his situation hopeless wanted to surrender, it would never be possible to win the war. Even in a situation that seemed utterly hopeless, quite often there was still some way out. For General Paulus, rejecting the surrender offer was his duty as a soldier. The only justification for surrender would have been the army's lack of a combat mission, i.e., the complete senselessness of further resistance. But here we touch the substance of the matter and find justification for the fact that Hitler forbade the Sixth Army to surrender and that the Army Group Command did not petition for the lifting of this prohibition. The Sixth Army, however futile its resistance in the future, was still to play a decisive role in the development of the general operational situation for as long as possible. It had to strive to restrain the enemy forces opposing it for as long as possible. In early December, according to our data, on the inner front of the encirclement of the Sixth Army, the enemy had up to 60 compounds. Part of them, no doubt, was removed from this front in connection with the offensive of the 4th Tank Army. But instead of them, the enemy was pulling up here new forces. By January 19, of the 259 enemy compounds which were, according to our data, in front of the front of Army Group Don, 90 compounds were bound by the Sixth Army. There is no need to analyze the consequences that would have threatened the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front in the event of the release of these 90 compounds, if the Sixth Army capitulated on January 9. How difficult was then the situation on this section of the front has already been shown above. The army could still fight, although for it the struggle was already futile. But the fact that it continued to hold on was decisive for the position of the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. On every day by which she could delay the release of enemy forces depended the fate of the Eastern Front as a whole. Now it may be said that the war was lost anyway, and that an earlier end would have avoided incalculable suffering. But this may be said by people who are inclined to draw conclusions ex post facto. In those days it was not at all a foregone conclusion that Germany would lose the war. It was quite possible to achieve a draw in the war, on the basis of which a draw in the political sphere could also be found. For this purpose it was necessary to stabilize the situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, which after all, and managed to do, but a necessary prerequisite for the successful solution of this problem was the continuation of the fight of the Sixth Army to the very last opportunity, in order to restrain the maximum number of enemy forces as long as possible. Only severe military necessity forced the General Command to demand from the brave troops of the Sixth Army, and this last sacrifice. True, it was also responsible for the fact that the Sixth Army fell into such a situation, but that is another matter altogether. After the Sixth Army rejected the enemy's ultimatum on January 9, on all parts of its front after a powerful artillery preparation began the enemy offensive with the participation of large forces of tanks. The main blow was struck at a prominent far westward protrusion of the army's defence line in the area of Marinovka. In a number of places the enemy managed to cut into the defence. On January 11, the situation became much more acute. Due to the shortage of ammunition and fuel, the army was not able to somehow restore the situation. Having lost their positions and, in particular, the settlements in the valley of the Karpovka River, the troops in the western section of the front were deprived of premises where they could at least to some extent shelter from the frost. The meteorological situation excluded any possibility of supplying the troops by air. This aggravation of the situation was expressed in the report of the 6th Army Headquarters of January 12, immediately transmitted by us to the OKH. This report stated, "In the heavy fighting of the last few days, the enemy, despite the heroic resistance of our troops, in a number of places deeply entrenched in the defence, his advance was hardly managed to suspend. There are no reserves. There is nothing to create them from. Ammunition remains for 3 days. Fuel ran out. Heavy weapons finally deprived of mobility. Heavy losses and poor supply, as well as frost, has greatly reduced the combat effectiveness of the troops. If the enemy's attacks continue with the same force for several more days, it will be impossible to hold the fortified line. Only separate pockets of resistance will remain." January 12 meteorological situation again did not allow to provide the army with everything necessary by air transportation, as well as to support it in heavy fighting with the actions of aviation. In the evening, General Pickett returned from the Cauldron, who was entrusted by the Air Command with the organization of transportation by air to supply the army. He outlined a stunning picture of the situation in the Cauldron. According to his calculations, the army could last no more than 2 to 4 days, however. The bravery and dedication of the soldiers of the 6th Army, as it turned out, refuted this calculation. He believed that improved supply by air could not now significantly change the situation, because the army did not have enough forces to eliminate the break in their defences. General Pickett brought a report from the commander of the 6th Army, Paulus, who was by then already promoted to Colonel General. From this report the following was evident. In the northwestern section of the enemy took the offensive by forces of 10-12 divisions. 3 and 29 MD were attacked from the northern flank. Part of their front was curtailed and part of the forces destroyed. Creating a new line of defence in this area seemed impossible. Brave troops from these divisions destroyed 100 enemy tanks, but he apparently still had 50 undamaged tanks at his disposal here. On the southern front of the Cauldron, despite the heroic resistance of 297 PD, the enemy, after a powerful artillery preparation, lasting 2 days, managed to cut deeply into the defence, and here there were no forces to eliminate the breakthrough. In this area was hit 40 tanks out of 100 and a little, thrown by the enemy in the battle in this area. The eastern front of the Cauldron still held, but even here the enemy pressure intensified. On the northeastern front, the enemy also managed to cut deeply into the defences. The forces of the 16th TD, which was defending this section, were exhausted. Colonel General Paulus reported further that the army will fight without leaving the place, to the last cartridge. Reducing the Cauldron, recommended by Hitler to General Hube, would only accelerate the defeat of the army, as heavy weapons could not be moved to other positions. In view of the fact that supply by air was always insufficient, its improvement could not now give a significant change in the situation. How long the army would be able to hold out depended only on the force with which the enemy would attack. In these days passed into the hands of the enemy and the airfield at the nursery. In the Cauldron at Stalingrad remained only airfield Gumrag. At night, Colonel General Paulus, despite this, reported that the continuation of the defence may be possible, if immediately in the Cauldron will be transferred several battalions with full armament. He had already repeatedly demanded that several thousand men be airlifted to him to make up for the army's losses. Army Group Command could not fulfill this requirement because he himself did not have any manpower reserves, not to mention the fact that at his disposal was not a single battalion that would not participate in the fighting. After the failure of the attempt of the 4th Panzer Army to unblock the 6th Army, the Army Group Command did not fulfill, in addition to the above reasons, this requirement, primarily because now it no longer considered itself entitled to move troops or replenishment in the Cauldron, It was already very difficult for us when we were forced to transfer to the 6th Army, returning from vacation commanders and staff officers who were extremely necessary there. But not to mention that the Army badly needed the officers. They themselves were eager to return to their troops at any cost. They, and among them were the descendants of such old soldierly families as Bismarck and Belov, proved by this that the tradition of duty and martial comradeship can withstand the severest trials. On January 13, an officer of the Operations Department of Colonel General Paulus's staff, Captain Bior of the General Staff, came to us with the log of the Army's combat operations. He was a young officer awarded the Knight's Cross. He was distinguished by his exemplary behavior and attitude to service. He told me how bravely the troops continued to fight, with what selflessness officers and soldiers accept their fate. He brought me a letter from General Paulus and my Chief of Staff a letter from his Chief of Staff. These letters were imbued with the spirit of courage, consciousness of duty and decency inherent in the German soldier. They were fully aware that the Army Group had done everything in its power to bail out the 6th Army. But the letters, of course, also expressed dismay that promises to improve the supply of the Army by air had not been fulfilled. However, neither I nor Colonel General von Richthofen never made such promises. Goering was responsible for this. January 16. On all fronts in the Army, new heavy fighting broke out. At times, the planes were no longer able to land. The losses of transport aircraft due to the activity of anti-aircraft artillery and enemy fighters in the daytime, and so became too great. Now, aviation could supply the Army only at night or by dropping cargoes by parachute. In this case, inevitably, a significant part of the cargo did not get to their destination. In these days, Hitler made Field Marshal Milch responsible for supplying the 6th Army by air. On January 17, the 6th Army reported by radio that the Gumrak airfield could again be used for landings. The Air Command held the opposite opinion. We nevertheless insisted on attempting a landing at this airfield. On January 19, I conferred for the first time with Milch, who was lightly wounded because the previous day on his way to me, his passenger car had collided with a steam locomotive. I emphasized that it was imperative to improve the supply of the 6th Army by the most decisive measures, even though the situation had already become hopeless. This is our duty towards our comrades, and we must fulfill it to the last hour. In addition, I pointed out that the Army restrains, as before, 90 enemy formations and thus fulfills an important operational task. Every day during which it will be possible to maintain the combat effectiveness of the Army will be decisive in view of the extremely difficult situation on the front of Army Group Don, and especially at its unprotected junction with Army Group B. Milch promised to use for this purpose all the means available in the rear, the last reserves of transport planes, as well as the men and means necessary for their repair. This was especially important now that the airfields at Morozovskoye and Tatsinskaya were in enemy hands, and transport planes had to be based at Rostov and Novocherkassk and even more distant airfields. It was clear from what Milch had said that if he had been entrusted with the task of supplying the 6th Army a few weeks earlier, it might have made things much easier, since he had at his disposal in the rear facilities, which were nevertheless beyond the reach of Richthofen. But the greater responsibility fell on Göring for his failure to see to it that these means were utilized in a timely manner. On January 24, the Army Group Headquarters received the following message from the Chief of the General Staff of the Land Forces, General Zeitzler. We have received the following radiogram. The fortress can only be held for a few days. Due to lack of supplies, people are exhausted. Weapons are deprived of mobility. The last airfield will soon be lost, as a result of which the possibility of supply will be minimized. There is no longer any reason to fulfill the combat task and hold Stalingrad. The Russians are already now making breakthroughs at various points along the front, as whole sections are denuded due to the loss of life. The heroism of commanders and soldiers is not broken, despite everything. To use this opportunity to strike the final blow, I intend, without waiting for the final collapse of the defense, give all units the order to break through in an organized manner to the southwest. Individual groups will be able to break through and disorganize the rear of the enemy. If we stay where we are, then, undoubtedly, everyone will die. The prisoners will also die of hunger and cold. I propose to take out of the cauldron individual specialists, soldiers and officers, who can be used in further combat operations. The order to do this should be given as soon as possible, because soon landing of airplanes will become impossible. Officers, please specify by name. About me, of course, is out of the question. Poor supply from the OCAM. See, the report is accepted. It fully coincides with my assumptions made 4 days ago, repeatedly reported to the Führer. The Führer as in regarding the attempt to break through. The Führer reserved the right to make the final decision. Please contact me again by radio if necessary. 2. Regarding the evacuation of specialists, the Führer refused the request. I request that Zitowitz be sent here to report again. He will report to the Führer together with me. In connection with this radiogram of Paulus, I would like to say the following about the evacuation of individuals. From a purely business point of view, it would naturally be desirable to save as many valuable specialists as possible, of course, regardless of their rank. And from the human point of view, it is clear that it would be desirable and necessary to try to save everyone. But this evacuation had to be considered from the point of view of soldiers' ethics. The norms of soldier ethics require that first of all the wounded should be evacuated. Measures to evacuate them were taken, and their effect in such a difficult situation was striking. But the evacuation of specialists could only be done at the expense of the evacuation of the wounded. In addition, inevitably the majority of the evacuated specialists would be officers, because they are due to their training and experience are more valuable in the war than ordinary soldiers. But in the situation in which the Sixth Army was, according to the concepts of German soldier ethics, when it came to saving lives, officers should have yielded first to the soldiers for whom they were responsible. Therefore, the Army Group Command did nothing to get Hitler to accept the proposal of the commander of the Sixth Army. As for the last-minute attempt to break through the enemy front in small groups, the final decision, the right to make which Hitler reserved for himself, was never made. Army Group Command, however, made an attempt to provide everything necessary for those groups of German soldiers who might be able to break through the encirclement front. For this purpose, it ordered to drop from airplanes food at various points behind enemy lines and gave reconnaissance aircraft the task of searching for such groups. But no such group reached our front line and was not detected by aviation. In any case, the radiogram of Colonel General Paulus indicates that at least those of the soldiers of the brave army, which still retained the remnants of strength, did not lose the will to resist. The Army Group headquarters was also aware that, above all, the young officers and soldiers who were still able to fight were determined, in spite of everything, to make a last-minute attempt to break through the enemy's encirclement front. That is why we took the above-mentioned measures, which, unfortunately, were in vain. On January 22, the Russians approached the airfield Gumrak, so that the landing of aircraft that provided supplies to the Sixth Army became impossible. Colonel General Paulus reported that he had no opportunity to eliminate the gap formed in the area of Gumrak. Ammunition and food were running out. He asked Hitler for permission to begin negotiations on surrender. On this issue, I conducted lengthy negotiations by telephone with Hitler. I requested that the army be allowed to surrender immediately. Although with each day approaching the surrender of the army, the overall situation on the front of the army grew complicated, I was still of the opinion that it was time to end the agony of the Sixth Army. In desperate battles, it was from the last strength to restrain a far superior enemy, and thus provided during this winter decisive help in saving the German Eastern Front. But henceforth the suffering of the army was no longer compensated for the benefit that it was able to bring by continuing to restrain the enemy forces. After a long and sharp arguments, Hitler rejected the request coming from Paulus and me, and gave the army an order to continue fighting until the last opportunity. He justified his point of view that every day, for which it will be possible to delay the enemy divisions near Stalingrad and delay their transfer to another section of the front, will have a decisive impact on the overall situation at the front. But the situation was already critical, because the Russians had meanwhile defeated the Hungarian army on the Don, so that Army Group B practically no longer existed. A gap was created in our front, stretching from Voroshilovgrad on the Donets to Voronezh on the Don. The large enemy forces advancing here had almost complete freedom of action. It seemed more than doubtful whether in this situation, whether it will be possible to save Army Group D and Army Group retreating at this time from the North Caucasus. Hitler believed that if the Sixth Army could not maintain a continuous front for longer, it could continue to resist for some time in several small cauldrons. In addition, he stated that surrender was futile since the Russians would not honor any conditions anyway. If not in words, he was essentially right in this, for out of the 90,000 prisoners who eventually found themselves in the hands of the Soviets, hardly a few thousand are now alive. At the same time, it should be emphasized that the Russians had serviceable railroads approaching Stalingrad, so that if they wished, they could ensure the supply and evacuation of the prisoners. A high death rate was inevitable because of the frost and exhaustion, but in this case the death rate exceeded all limits. These telephone conversations with Hitler lasted, as I recall, at least 45 minutes. I cannot say with certainty that the arguments he made that every day during which the Sixth Army would be able to shackle the enemy's forces in battle was decisive, and that the Soviets would still lose prisoners, fully reflected his thoughts. He was a fanatic, and the thought of surrendering one army of the Third Empire could seem so unacceptable to him that no reasonable arguments mattered to him. When Hitler rejected my request to now allow the Sixth Army to surrender, I personally faced the question of whether, in view of this disagreement, I should not resign my command of the army group. It was not the first time that this question had arisen before me. It was especially acute in front of me in the Christmas days of 1942, when I unsuccessfully sought Hitler's permission to carry out a breakthrough of the Sixth Army. In general, this question often came before me at that time and in the following months. I think it is understandable my desire to be free of responsibility, to take on which was almost impossible, because every decision caused by military necessity had to defend in an endless, requiring a great expenditure of nervous energy struggle with his own general command. That I often wondered about this question is evidenced by the following words of Colonel Buss, Chief of Operations, to the Chief of Army Engineers shortly after Christmas 1942. If I had not constantly begged him to stay in his post for the sake of our troops, he would have long ago spat and told Hitler that he had had enough. This sharp statement of my closest aide best characterizes my position and my thoughts at the time. But here I would still like to say a few words on the question of the resignation of a military commander in the active army. First of all, it should be borne in mind that a military commander in a high position, as well as any other soldier in the war, cannot just take and go home. Hitler was under no obligation to accept my resignation. In this case, he would have hardly accepted it either. A soldier in war does not enjoy the advantages of a politician who can quit at any time if things go badly, or if the course of the government is not to his liking. The soldier must fight as he is ordered and where he is ordered. There are, of course, occasions when a military commander cannot take responsibility for carrying out an order given. These are cases when he is forced to say what Seydlitz said at the Battle of Zirndorf. After the battle, the king may have my head, but during the battle let him let me use it myself. No general can justify his defeat in battle by saying that he was obliged to carry out the order that led to the defeat, even though he knew that he should have acted differently. In this case, there is only one course left, disobeying the order, and for this he answers with his head. His fate is usually decided by success or failure. For the same reasons, I, contrary to the categorical demand of Hitler, gave December 19 Sixth Army order as soon as possible to prepare for a breakthrough to the southwest. If this order did not lead to success, the reason was the refusal of the Sixth Army to fulfill. It is hardly possible to give a definitive answer to the question whether the command of the Sixth Army had sufficient reasons for not using the last opportunity to save the army, because no one can say whether this breakthrough would have actually succeeded or not. I subsequently did not fulfill in some cases operational instructions of Hitler when it was unavoidable, and success showed that I was right, and Hitler had to put up with the non-fulfillment of his instructions. As for the question of resignation, in addition to the above considerations, it is hindered by another circumstance. This is a high sense of responsibility for his soldiers, which should be inherent in every military leader. I was obliged to think then not only about the Sixth Army. At stake was the fate of the entire Army Group Don and Army Group C, the refusal to fulfill the task entrusted to me, no matter how it was justified from the human point of view in view of Hitler's position in the issue of the surrender of the Sixth Army, seemed to me a betrayal of our brave soldiers who were outside the Stalingrad cauldron and also fought not for life but for death. In the future, the command of Army Group Don still managed to cope with the situation, which was one of the most critical in the entire war. I think that this fact justifies the decision I made that day. I still decided not to abandon the case entrusted to me, to which I was forced by Hitler's position. A brief review of the development of the situation in January 1944 on the front of Army Groups Don, A and B shows how necessary it was up to this point, that the Sixth Army continued to resist stubbornly and to restrain the far numerically superior enemy forces. December 29. Oak, finally yielding to the persistent and constant requests of Army Group Don, ordered Army Group A to withdraw from the Caucasus region on the Kuma River, that is, on the border of Pyatigorsk-Praskovaya. First of all, its left flank, the 1st Tank Army, was to withdraw. In order to preserve equipment, this withdrawal was made extremely slowly. At the beginning of this maneuver, troops have not yet been released. By January 9, when the 6th Army rejected the offer of surrender, the 1st Tank Army had not yet reached the Kuma River boundary. 4 Tank Army had the task of covering the rear of Army Group south of the Don River, and at the same time to protect its communications, passing through Rostov. In heavy fighting with the enemy, who had multiple superiority in strength, it was pushed south of the Don and withdrew through Kotelnikovo to the west. On January 9, it fought heavy battles on the Kubali River between Sal and Menik. It became clear that the enemy was trying to cover it from both flanks. The 3rd Guards Tank Corps of the enemy stood on the Don at Konstantinovka, and from here turned southeast to Prolitowskaya to hit the rear of the 4th Tank Army. The enemy's 28th Army, which came up again from the Kalmyk steppes, sought to cover the 4th Tank Army from the south, striking along the Menik River. Dolidet's group, conducting heavy defensive battles in a large bend of the Don, was forced to withdraw to the boundary of the Kagalonik River, and here the enemy had already managed to break through its positions on the southern flank. January 7, the enemy small forces forced the Don northeast of Novocherkassk, where the headquarters of the Army Group. On the northern flank of Golets Group, between the rivers Bystraya, Zinaya, and Kalitva, the 7th TD tried to prevent the enemy's advance to the crossing of the Don River near Forchstate, making short counterattacks. So the river crossing at Kamensk was defended only by hastily formed combat groups of furloughed soldiers, soldiers of the rear services, etc., as well as by the remnants of the Romanian troops. But, as a matter of fact, even here the Romanians disappeared from the battlefield. Farther to the northwest, on the front of Army Group B, gaped a wide gap, formed as a result of the defeat of the Italian army. In the area of Milarovo fought a relatively weak battle group of General Fretapico of Army Group B. At times it was almost completely surrounded. By January 24, i.e., by the day when the 6th Army, which up to that moment still maintained a solid front, broke up into 3 separate groups, which, subjected to pressure from all sides, fought in Stalingrad and its environs, and when, therefore, the army could no longer restrain significant enemy forces, the situation at the front looked as follows. The northern flank of Army Group was still at Belaya Glina, and further south its front still passed east of Armavir, that is 150-200 kilometers from Rostov. OK finally authorized the withdrawal of the main forces of the 1st Tank Army through Rostov. At the front of Army Group Don, 4 Tank Army fought fierce battles in the southeastern approaches to Rostov, covering the crossing of the Don, which crossed the 1 Tank Army. In the future, according to my decision, the 1st Tank Army was to be transferred to the left flank of the Army Group and occupy the front along the Don River above Voroshilovgrad. Task Force Golit defended the Donets on the section from its possession of the Don to Forchstate. The Frega Picot Battle Group, which by this time had been transferred to my command, was defending the Donets on both sides of Kamensk. By November 19, as a result of the defeat of the Italian army and the soon after defeat of the Hungarian army on the Don, a gap had been created on the front of Army Group B from Voroshilovgrad on the Donets to Voronezh on the Don. On January 23, the section of the so-called front to Starobelsk was subordinated to Army Group Don. Practically on this section was only more or less shattered in the battle's 19 TD, which was forced to leave Starobelsk under the onslaught of 3 corps of the enemy. When the last resistance of the 6th Army ceased on February 1, the enemy threatened to force Donets near Voroshilovgrad with the forces of 3 tank, 1 mechanized and 1 rifle corps. At the same time, he apparently launched an offensive on the Lysychansk-Slaviansk line with the forces of 3 to 4 tank corps and 1 rifle corps. There is no need to consider specifically how events would have developed between January 9 and February 1, or what consequences it would have led to in the future, if the 6th Army, with its heroic resistance, would not have constrained for so long large enemy forces that were near Stalingrad. However, let us return to the last battles of the 6th Army. January 24, the front of the army broke up into 3 small cauldrons on the northern outskirts, in the center and on the southern outskirts of Stalingrad. On January 31, the army commander, who by then had been promoted to field marshal, was taken prisoner by the Soviet army. On February 1, the last northern grouping, the remnants of the 11th Army, surrendered. The fighting of the 6th Army was over. What could not do the heaviest battles, cruel hunger and bitter frosts of the Russian steppe, the Soviet captivity completed. This was the fate of these soldiers, who surrendered only when their exhausted hands were no longer able to hold their weapons, when their stiffened fingers could no longer shoot, when they ran out of ammunition and were defenseless before the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy. Still, thanks to the dedication of German pilots from the Cauldron, managed to evacuate about 30,000 wounded. Those who would like to know who is responsible for the tragic death of the 6th Army gave an unequivocal answer: Hitler himself. February 5. I was summoned to the Führer's headquarters, although before this rejected all my requests that Hitler personally familiarize himself with the situation on our front, or sent for this purpose at least the Chief of the General Staff or General Jodl. Hitler opened the meeting with the following words: "For Stalingrad, I alone am responsible. I could, perhaps, say that Goering misinformed me about the possibilities of supply by air, and thus shift at least part of the responsibility to him. But he is my successor, whom I myself appointed myself, and therefore I cannot allow him to be responsible for Stalingrad." One cannot but admit that Hitler on this occasion took full responsibility and made no attempt to find escape. But still he did not draw conclusions for the future from this heavy defeat, the blame for which lay on him as Commander-in-Chief. However, above the question of responsibility and above all ideological conclusions, which came later under the influence of the hardships of captivity, under the influence of propaganda, and because of the understandable bitterness of some officers and soldiers sacrificed 6th Army, is the following fact: by their incomparable bravery and fidelity to their duty, the soldiers and officers of this army have erected a monument to the spirit of the German soldier, which will stand for eternity, although it is neither cast in bronze nor carved in stone. It is an invisible monument on which are inscribed the words that stand at the beginning of this narrative of the great tragedy of the German soldier. With the 6th Army at Stalingrad perish. Yes, of the headquarters of the 4th, 8th, 11th and 51st Army Corps, and the headquarters of the 14th Tank Corps. 44, 71, 76, 113, 295, 207, 371, 376, 384, 389, and 394 Infantry Division, 100 Mountain Division, 13, 16, and 24 Armoured Divisions, 329 and 60 motorized divisions, as well as numerous separate army and argue units. In addition, 1 Romanian cavalry division and 20 Romanian infantry division were killed. At the end of 1942, beginning of 1944, the eyes of all Germany were turned to Stalingrad. With anxiety and pleading in her heart, Germany thought about her sons fighting there. But at the same time, on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, there was a struggle, the outcome of which was of even greater importance, and in comparison with which even the struggle for the life and freedom of 200,000 brave soldiers of the 6th Army receded into the background. In this struggle, it was not only about the fate of one army, but about the fate of the entire southern wing of the German Eastern Front and, ultimately, the fate of the entire Eastern Front. This struggle did not end in tragic defeat. For the last time in the war, the end of this struggle was marked by the triumph of victory of the German army. This struggle, not to mention the fact that at the beginning it was closely connected with the battles of the 6th Army, consisted of such a mass of tense positions and almost deadly crises that this campaign can rightly be ranked among the most exciting stages of the Second World War. The German army in this campaign could no longer expect to win the final victory. In view of the mistakes made in the conduct of the summer and fall campaign of 1942, it could only be a matter of coping with defeat, as Schlieffen once put it. So, in battles against an enemy with a significant superiority in strength, and having on its side all the advantages of the operational environment, which presented him with every chance of victory, the German command had to find new ways out of the situation, and the German troops had to endure new unheard-of hardships. These battles are worthy of description, although they were not accompanied by trumpet signals heralding victory, nor by the deafening drumbeat that marked the demise of the 6th Army. As this campaign was a retreat, it cannot claim great glory, but it did not end in defeat. Its completion once again gave the German commanders the opportunity to achieve at least a draw in the war, which is perhaps more than a mere mediocre victory. The strategic foundations of the winter campaign. To realize the significance of this decisive struggle, as well as the gravity of the danger threatening the German army, it is necessary to outline the operational situation at the beginning of this campaign. In the winter of 1940-42, the forces of the Soviet army were only enough to repel the German offensive on Moscow and thus halt the German advance along the entire front. In the summer of 1942, the wave of the German offensive to the east rose again and gradually froze near the Volga and the Caucasus Mountains. Now, in the winter of 1942-43, the enemy felt strong enough to try to wrest the initiative from our hands. It was a matter of whether already this winter will be made a decisive step towards the defeat of Germany in the east. The catastrophe of the Sixth Army, no matter how heavy and sad it was in itself, compared to the scale of the Second World War as a whole, could not yet be such a step, but the defeat of the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front would have opened the way to an early victory over Germany. The Soviet command could count on achieving this goal on the southern flank for two reasons. The first was the vast numerical superiority of the Russian army, and the second was the advantages of the operational situation, which the Soviet command had gained through the mistakes of the German command associated with Stalingrad. The Soviet command undoubtedly strove for this goal, although it did not achieve it. Let us briefly outline the strategic situation in which this winter campaign began in the south of the Eastern Front. The German front ran in a great eastward curving arc across the North Caucasus and eastern Ukraine. The right flank of this arc at Novorossiysk rested on the Black Sea. Further, the front of Army Group passed along the North Caucasus, but in the east of the direct contact with the shore of the Caspian Sea did not have. Deep open flank of this south-facing front was covered from the lower Volga 16 MD, located in the Kalmyk steppes east of Elista. Only south of Stalingrad began a continuous front of Army Group B, which then retreated back to the Don and ran along the Don to Voronezh. Here stood the 4th Romanian Army, 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army, 3rd Romanian Army, Italian Army, and another German army. The main German forces had already been concentrated for months in a fist near Stalingrad, while the rest of the front, mainly the Don River frontier, was largely entrusted to the Allied armies. Neither Army Group A nor Army Group B had any significant reserves. These two groups of armies were opposed by the Caucasus Front, the Southwestern Front and the Voronezh Front of the enemy, who not only had numerical superiority on the front line, but also had very large reserves. The enemy had, furthermore, large reserves in the central section of the Eastern Front, as well as in the deep rear. To assess how dangerous the situation was and what advantages it gave the enemy, it is necessary to recall some strategically significant distances. The distance from the Don River frontier, where the 3rd Romanian Army was defeated on November 19, as well as from the Italian-defended frontier along the Don River at Kazanskaya to the Don crossing at Rostov, was just over 300 km in a straight line. Through Rostov passed communications not only the entire Army Group A, but also the 4th Romanian and 4th Panzer armies. The distance from the left flank of Army Group A in the Caucasus to Rostov was at least 600 km, and from the 4th Tank Army, standing south of Stalingrad, was about 400 km. Further to the west, the communications of the southern wing of the German army passed through the crossings of the Dnieper River in the cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk. The capacity of the route through the Crimea and the Kerch Strait to the Caucasus was small. The main crossings across the Dnieper in the rear of the southern wing of the German army were distant from Stalingrad by almost 700 km, and from the left wing of the Caucasus front by almost 900 km. At the same time, the distance to them from the enemy front was about only 420 km. I knew very well from my own experience what such a position meant. After all, in the summer of 1941, I, with my tank corps, passed the 300-kilometer distance from Tilsit to Vinsk in 4 days, overcoming the resistance, which was, in any case, much more stubborn than that which the Romanian, Italian and Hungarian armies were giving to the Russians on the Don. In addition, the Russians at that time had incomparably more reserves behind their front than we had in the winter of 1942. Besides the advantages of the strategic situation, the Soviets had a huge numerical superiority. The ratio of forces by the time of the beginning of the fighting of Army Group Don has already been shown at the beginning of the chapter on Stalingrad. This ratio change during the winter can be shown by means of two figures. In March 1944, Army Group South had 32 divisions on the 700-kilometre front from the Sea of Azov to the area north of Kharkov. The enemy had on this front, including reserves, 341 units. Thus, two factors determined the situation in which Army Group Don was fighting and formed a constant background against which the events depicted below unfolded. First, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy. Even after the Army Group was reinforced by one Panzer Army and the troops transferred to it by the General Command and included 3 and then 4 German armies, the ratio of forces of German troops and enemy troops was equal to 1:7. Secondly, the strategic threat, which consisted in the fact that the numerically superior enemy, who at times during operations had complete freedom of action due to the defeat of the Allied armies, was closer to the vital communications nodes of the southern wing of the German Neri to Rostov and crossings across the Dnieper. Both these factors caused the danger that this southern wing will be cut off from its communications, pressed to the shore of the Azov, and then the Black Sea and here destroyed. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet still had the ability to paralyze our transports across this sea. With the destruction of Army Groups Don and A, sooner or later the fate of the entire Eastern Front would be decided. The main operational positions, the fighting on the southern wing of the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942-43, which represented the essence of the entire winter campaign in the East, as shown by the initial operational situation described above, came down to a struggle between us and the enemy for the resolution of the following problem: whether the Soviets would succeed in encircling the southern wing of the German army and thus make the first step toward achieving final victory in the war, or whether the German command would succeed in preventing such a catastrophe. For the Soviet side, the operational plan was, if I may say so, clear as the palm of the hand. The German command itself prepared it for the Russians, moving to the positional conduct of hostilities on the borders reached by the end of the summer offensive. Nothing was more natural than the decision of the Russians to use the situation in order to take in pincers concentrated near Stalingrad's Sixth Army. In the further course of operations, the enemy sought to use his crushing success in the areas occupied by the Romanian, Italian and Hungarian troops in order to bypass the southern wing of the German army from the north or west, striking again and again with ever larger forces and at greater depth. Its aim was to cut off this wing from its communications leading to the western flank of this front, in order to eventually encircle it at the seacoast. Such an operational plan was directly imposed by the situation which the German command had maintained for too long on the southern wing of the German. How to get inside faced a much more difficult question: how to get rid of the danger in which it found itself through its own fault, and as a result of the unexpected initial successes of the enemy north and south of Stalingrad. In this case, the general command of the German army from the very first day of the enemy's offensive should have been clear: how under the given general strategic situation will develop events, especially what danger from the very beginning threatens the standing in the Caucasus Army Group. The German command had, in fact, to choose between two ways. The first way was to immediately after the beginning of the enemy offensive at Stalingrad to withdraw from the Volga Sixth Army and try to restore the situation in the large bend of the Don, pulling together here large forces. This would simultaneously require strengthening with the help of German troops to strengthen those areas of defense along the Don, which were occupied by the Allied armies. But apparently the German High Command did not have the forces necessary for this decision, and the low capacity of the few available railroads here would not allow him to timely transfer troops here. It could not decide to withdraw the Sixth Army from Stalingrad. A few weeks after the beginning of the Soviet offensive, it was already clear that the Sixth Army would be completely lost, and that in the general plan of operations its only task could be to shackle the largest possible enemy forces for a possibly longer time. This task brave Sixth Army fulfilled to the end. For the sake of its fulfillment, it sacrificed itself. After Hitler's stubborn unwillingness to give up Stalingrad situation became threatening, after all hope for the rescue of the Sixth Army was lost, the German High Command could choose another way. Leaving the territory occupied during the summer campaign, it would be possible to use the severe crisis for victory. For this purpose, it was necessary to withdraw the troops of Army Groups A and Don in an organized manner from the far eastward protruding arc of the front beyond the lower Don and Donets, and further beyond the lower Dnieper. At the same time, it would be necessary to concentrate, for example, in the area of Kharkov, all the forces available to the command, including the divisions of both groups of armies, released as a result of the reduction of the front line. This grouping would be tasked to strike in the flank of the enemy forces pursuing the retreating army groups, or seeking to cut off their way to cross the Dnieper. Thus, there would be a transition from a retreating operation on a large scale to a bypass operation, in which the German troops would pursue the goal of pressing the enemy to the sea, and there to destroy it. Army Group Command proposed this solution, when there was lost hope for the release of the 6th Army from the encirclement, when in addition became clear shaky position of the group in the Caucasus, and when the danger of cutting off the entire southern wing of the breakthrough of the enemy on the front of the Italian army. So it was not in the character of Hitler to agree with the decision, which, above all, required the abandonment of the achievements of the summer campaign, and in addition was very risky in operational terms. This decision was incompatible with those traits of Hitler's character, which are discussed in the chapter Hitler, Supreme Commander. Not having sufficient experience in operational matters, he may then still really hoped that it will be possible to save the situation on the southern flank with the help of the SS Panzer Corps, heading for Kharkov. So when the headquarters of Army Group Don took command of this section of the front, the first of the above-mentioned ways to restore the position in the large bend of the Don was already closed due to the completed enemy encirclement of the 6th Army. In order to conduct the battle in the Don Bend with the hope of success, Army Group Don, created from the remnants of the various associations, did not have enough forces, and the reinforcements that came in drop by drop also did not change matters, especially since these reinforcements soon after the defeat of the Italian army began to be sent to Army Group B. So that we did not have enough power to choose the second way, to begin on a large scale a withdrawal, and then immediately counterattack on the northern flank of the enemy, which he would put under attack in pursuit of the retreating forces. For this purpose, it was necessary to have under his command the entire southern wing of the front, and freely dispose of the reserves of the Oak. Army Group had to solve those problems that again and again confronted it on its allotted section of the front. It had to always find ways out of the situation to cope with the danger caused by the initial strategic situation, and became more and more formidable. This danger was that could be cut off the entire southern wing of the German army. The first task that faced the Army Group was to release from the encirclement of the 6th Army. All other operational considerations receded before this to the background. When to solve this problem for the reasons discussed in the chapter The Stalingrad Tragedy, it was impossible, before the Army Group in full growth of the task, to prevent an even greater disaster, threatening to cut off the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. The forces still in reserve was not enough to provide cover for the communications of the southern wing, passing through the lower Don and Dnieper. There was only one way, to pull back the eastern flank of the Army Group, and the freed forces to transfer to the western flank. The task of Army Group was, therefore, in the following. In time, or rather in advance, transferring forces from the eastern flank to the western flank, in time to repel the enemy strikes, seeking to realize an ever deeper coverage from the west. This task was especially complicated by the fact that our northern neighbor in the end completely disappeared from the front as a result of the defeat of the Allied armies. At the same time, the forces transferred to the western flank would not be enough, unless it would also use the troops of Army Group A, which was not subordinate to us. This was essentially the same task that faced General Paulus at Stalingrad between November 19 and 23, although its scale was, of course, larger and time for its implementation was more. This task was to move forces in a timely manner and without paying attention to the private consequences in some areas, to those points on which depended on the cover of communications, and at the same time to retain operational freedom of action. But for General Paulus, the outcome of the operation could be decided in a few days, perhaps even hours, and he did not have to count on reinforcements. For our Army Group, this task was the core of all its operational activities, and around it for weeks and months we fought with the General Command. The idea of preventing the enemy's attempts to cut off our flank, making for this timely coupling of forces from east to west, was nothing complicated. It can hardly claim to be a particularly clever strategic idea. But in war, It is often the simplest things that turn out to be the most difficult. Difficulties usually lie not in the solution as such, but in its consistent implementation. In this case, the withdrawal of troops from the eastern flank created a threat on that flank. Whether it will be able to cope with it or not, it was impossible to predict. But in order for this transfer of forces to have a timely effect, it had to begin in advance. A few weeks before the danger of cutting off the southern flank was already directly and acutely felt. Hitler then did not yet realize or did not want to recognize this danger. In addition, as will be shown below, the development of the situation in front of the front of Army Group for a long time hindered the implementation of the Rockade maneuver. The operational concept underlying the action plan of the Army Group was simple and generally understood, but the more difficult was to persistently pursue it in the increasingly complex situation. And no less difficult was to defend this point of view before the High Command, seeking every time at the last moment to agree to implement the necessary measures, because the High Command essentially stood on diametrically opposed positions. Hitler was always in principle for the persistent retention of captured, while we saw the means to achieve victory in maneuvering operations, as in this respect the enemy was inferior to our command and our troops. So the nature of the situation that had developed on the front by the time of the formation of the Army Group, the limitations arising from the fact that it largely depended on the combat operations of neighboring army groups, and changes in the situation in front of their front, as well as imposed on it by the General Command, caused the development of a system of exits from the situation, which allowed the Army Group Command to still steadily carry out its main operational plan. The winter campaign of 1942-33, conducted by Army Group Don, in accordance with the above, was divided into 4 consecutive phases. The first phase, the struggle to free the 6th Army from encirclement. In it, Army Group put everything at stake. The second phase was the struggle to cover the rear of Army Group during its withdrawal from the Caucasus Front. The third phase includes the actual struggle to cover the communications of the southern wing of the German army in order to prevent it from being cut off. From it follows the last, 4th phase. In this phase, the group of armies manages, although not in full, after the withdrawal to implement a counterstrike. The result of this counterattack is the victory at Kharkov. It's the first phase, the struggle for the liberation of the 6th Army. Above we have already told about the attempt to unblock the 6th Army, or to provide it with the opportunity to make a breakthrough from the Stalingrad cauldron. Striving, at all costs, to achieve success in this attempt, the command of the Army Group took the most extreme risks. Up to the moment when the fate of the 6th Army was finally decided, it tried to do with a minimum of forces in the centre and on the left flank of the Army Group, where the front was already only a weak line of barriers. It sought to avoid decisive clashes in these areas until the battles of the 4th Panzer Army east of the Don did not give the desired success. That is, until the 6th Army was not opened the way to liberation. The Army Group Command was forced to concentrate all its efforts on the task of saving the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front after, for the reasons discussed above, had to give up the hope that the 4th Panzer Army will break through to join the 6th Army, and when, in addition, as a result of the defeat of the Italian army exposed the western flank of the group, Don and the enemy opened the way to Rostov. We still need to briefly dwell on the aggravation of the situation on the front of the Group Don, which was a consequence of the forced refusal to release the 6th Army from the encirclement and changes on the right flank of the Group B. Above we have already outlined the predicament in which found itself on the eastern flank of the Group 4 tank army due to the fact that the enemy threw against it more and more large forces removed from the inner front of the encirclement at Stalingrad. In the battles between the Aksai River and Kotelnikov, as well as in the battles for the capture of this initial bridgehead for the offensive to unblock the encircled troops, 57T suffered heavy losses, as the Romanians fled, leaving it alone on the battlefield. Particularly great were the losses of the 23rd TD, which had been badly damaged even before, since the group did not receive reinforcements from the Group I, which the Group Command demanded. It was generally doubtful whether the 4th Tank Army would be able to give the enemy a strong enough resistance and prevent him from striking with large forces in the rear of the 1st Tank Army. The situation was no less critical in the rest of the front of the Don Group. In the area formerly occupied by the 3rd Romanian Army, the 4th Tank Army was pushed back by the enemy on the eastern bank of the Don. This gave the enemy the opportunity to force on the Ice Don in the area of Potemkinskaya, and then soon in the area of Timyanskaya, which created a threat to the flank and rear of our troops engaged in the defense along the River Char. On this section of the front was now commanded by General Mitt. In view of the Russians forcing the Don from the east and from the south, we had nothing else to do but to gradually withdraw General Mitt's group behind the Kagalnik River. However, a much more critical situation than here developed on the left flank of the army group. General Hollitz's group still managed, despite the flight of Romanian divisions, to withdraw its forces from the upper Chira to the south. But the newly formed division, which was assigned to cover the flank of Golitz's group at the Bystraya Ginilea River, retreated in this area without sufficient necessity, and thus left the enemy crossing at Milutinskoye. This opened the way to the flank of Golitz's group, as well as to the important airbase at Morozovskoye. Even worse was the fact that due to the collapse of the Italian army and the flight of almost all Romanian troops, the enemy could move in the direction of crossings across the Dondies near Balea Kalitva, Kamensk and Voroshilovgrad, meeting almost no resistance. Only in the area of Milarovo, as a lonely island in the Red Surf, resisted the newly created on the right flank of Army Group B Group Fretapico. But still the enemy had the opportunity at his discretion to turn to the east to hit the rear of the group of Hollit or Maita group, or continue to move south towards Rostov. Situation of Army Group Don was very serious. If it was only about our group, it would be necessary to immediately proceed to the steady implementation of the plan to transfer forces from east to west, so that thus to cope with the critical situation. It was necessary to quickly move the 4th Panzer Army to Rostov, to then use it to protect the left flank and cover the group's communications going west. The troops of the Mita Group and the Golit Group, which were still fighting in a large bend of the Don, should have been withdrawn to the Donets. But such a decision was hindered by the fact that Army Group R was still stationary in its positions in the Caucasus. In no case could not expose its rear, which would lead to the above-discussed regrouping. On the contrary, Don Group was not only to cover a group from the rear, but also to protect its communications through Rostov. Thus, it was not yet possible to proceed to the implementation of the main operational plan, which basically and should be guided by the command of the group. It was to prevent the cut-off of the southern wing of the army, concentrating the main forces of the group on its western flank. In the first weeks after taking command of the group, we deliberately refused to fulfill this task and directed all efforts to the liberation of the 6th Army. Now in the second phase of the campaign, we found ourselves forced to fight desperately to cover the rear of Army Group A, despite the fact that the situation on our western flank was becoming increasingly threatening. The second phase, the struggle to cover the rear of Army Group A. The German High Command, in fact, from the very beginning should have been clear that Army Group will not be able to hold in the Caucasus if it is not possible in the near future to release the 6th Army from the encirclement, and, therefore, it will not be possible to stabilize the situation in the area of a large bend of the Don. When a gap was formed on the left flank of the Group B, and the enemy opened the way to Rostov, then it should have become quite clear that to hold on to the Caucasus in any case will not be possible, unless only Hitler wanted and could transfer here large forces from other theatres. As early as December 20, when the escape of 2 Italian divisions exposed the flank of the Group Golit and the Russian opened the way to the crossings across the Donets, I expressed to General Zeitzler the consideration that now the enemy will seek to deliver a decisive blow to the entire southern wing of the German army, advancing in the direction of Rostov. December 24, I again reminded him that now already decides the fate of not only the Group Don, but also the Group A. I have already written above that my demand for the transfer of troops from the composition of Group, a 4-tank army, and their transfer to the Rostov area was rejected. Even if there was no hope of making a new attempt to save the 6th Army, such a reinforcement of the 4th Panzer Army would be in the interests of Army Group A. The defeat of the 4th Tank Army would have opened the way for the enemy to the rear of Army Group. The reluctance of the command of Army Group A to give us any troops was understandable. So General Command had to order the urgently required equal distribution of forces between both groups of armies. One of the reasons for the refusal of Group A to give us the requested divisions was, apparently, also the fact that its units were heavily mixed. Removing large formations from the front would have been very difficult and time-consuming. Not having sufficient reserves, The group had to still somehow patch up the front breakthroughs that occurred under enemy attacks, and as a result, and it turned out that its units were very mixed. Another reason for this was the fact that Army Group for a number of months did not have its own commander, who would monitor the observance of order in the grouping of troops. There are such commanders who do not take into account that the troops can retain their operational mobility and perform the most difficult tasks assigned to them only if in the course of hostilities are not violated their regular organization. But if, as was the case here, for a long time there is no responsible commander at all, it is not surprising that the units are mixed up. Yielding to the constant demands of the command of the group turn, Hitler finally decided to order the withdrawal of the flank of the group far to the west to the section Pyatigorsk, Praskovaya along the river Kulm. But he was by no means going to leave the entire Caucasus front. Apparently, he still hoped that by withdrawing to the Kuma eastern flank of group, we'll be able to join this flank to the Menich depression to restore the situation in the area between the Menich and the Don and in a large bend of the Don, and at the same time to protect going west across the Dnieper communications of the southern wing of the German army. Thus, he was not going to eliminate at all, but only to reduce the Balcony, which was formed in November as a result of the front's advance to the Volga and the Caucasus, and which was the cause of an unfavourable for us change in the situation. From where the forces were to appear that could replace the withdrawn two Romanian and Italian and then Hungarian armies, the answer to this question remained a mystery. This inevitably then led to the need to withdraw and the entire Caucasus front. At this second stage of the fighting Army Group to fight to gain time in this increasingly aggravated situation, instead of in accordance with the general situation to eliminate the threat of cutting off the southern wing, resolutely concentrating all its efforts on the western flank. South of the lower reaches of the Don Group, Don was to cover the rear of the group, and at the same time to protect its communications running through Rostov. This dual task was, to all appearances, impossible for the 4th Tank Army because its forces were insignificant. Its defended territory from the Don to the Caucasus was too vast, and the enemy operating here was too strong. In a large bend of the Don, and in front of the Donets operated Group Golet, it was to delay the enemy's advance north of the lower Don, so that he could not a swift blow from the east to Rostov cut off the rear of the 4th Tank Army, and together with it and Army Group, at the same time, it was to prevent the enemy from forcing the Donets at Fortstady, Kamensk, Voroshilovgrad, and thus block the approaches to Rostov from the north. Finally, the Army Group had to find a way to protect the communications leading westward to the lower Dinzea with its own forces and means, using also the meagre reinforcements sent by the OK. And all these tasks had to be carried out by the troops, which had long been carrying an exorbitant load and were numerically far inferior to the opposing enemy troops. This task in itself was very heavy, but the main danger was that the group could not quickly leave the area of the Caucasus. So once again it became apparent that positional warfare, and on this front the fighting took exactly this character, leads to the loss of flexibility of control and mobility of troops. In positional warfare, because of the need to save forces, it is impossible to do without stationary installation of weapons. It is necessary to accumulate ammunition and food to create various amenities for the troops, which are especially necessary when the lack of reserves does not allow their change of positions. Forces are usually difficult to feed close to the stabilized front, so they have to be placed further in the rear, as a result of which the troops are more or less deprived of mobility. The condition of the roads during the Russian winter, especially in mountainous terrain, also created great difficulties. All this leads to the fact that the troops and commanders lose the ability to quickly respond to changes in the situation, which are now and then take place in maneuver warfare. The factor of inertia, stagnation, becomes dominant, as every change is associated with difficult changes of troops, regrouping of forces, inconvenience, and often death. Because of the inevitable accumulation of weapons, equipment, and all sorts of property are created large stocks, all that, as it is believed, cannot do without in further combat operations. When the command is forced to conduct a major maneuver in order to withdraw to new positions, it takes a lot of time to prepare for it. And sometimes, unwilling to part with all this supposedly necessary equipment, the command even gives up the idea of such a major maneuver, although it may be the only way to success in the future. It will be recalled that even such an outstanding commander as Ludendorff, in 1918, after the German offensive had been halted, did not dare to make a withdrawal on a large scale in order to proceed to maneuver actions, although in them lay Germany's last hope of victory. The reason for this was ultimately that he did not consider himself entitled to sacrifice the material means and military equipment available at the front and in the army rear, or could not reconcile himself to the fact that he would have to leave the territory occupied at the cost of great sacrifice. Similar was the case in Army Group A. From the negotiations with its Chief of Staff, held on December 29, it became clear that the 1st Panzer Army will be able to begin the withdrawal only on January 2. Our assistance with fuel allowed it to begin this withdrawal on January 1. But a few days later, the headquarters of Army Group had reported that the withdrawal of the 1st Panzer Army to the Kuma River frontier could be carried out only gradually from frontier to frontier to ensure the removal of property and evacuation of the wounded who were in hospitals in the Caucasus resort. The army would need 155 echelons for this purpose, and thus it would be able to completely withdraw to the Kuma River frontier only in 25 days. Thus, nothing was prepared in advance for the necessity of withdrawal of the army, although at least from the end of November it should have been clear that the enemy would sooner or later begin to threaten Group A from the rear. Preparations for withdrawal was not carried out, of course, because Hitler forbade all preparations of this kind and would not have allowed it if he had known about it. But a significant role in this played, undoubtedly, and the fact that Army Group at that time did not have its own commander, who would have been fully responsible for it. We wanted at one time to subordinate Army Group A, the commander which recently took command of Colonel General von Kleist, me. In general, such a subordination of a group of armies or army commander of a neighbouring equal association only brings harm. But in the then critical situation, it still gave some advantages, provided, however, that this subordination was complete and unconditional. Any interference by Hitler, as well as any possibility of turning the Group A to him in case of disagreement with my orders, but Hitler was unwilling to comply with these requirements, which I put before the OK as a prerequisite on which depended my agreement to fully assume responsibility for both groups of armies. Army Group thus retained its independence. The command of the Don Group had no choice but to insist again and again on the accelerated implementation of Army Group A of the measures outlined, in order to get at its disposal, as soon as possible, released their forces, the use of which south of the Don, and then on the western flank of the Don Group, was decisive. It was necessary to complete as soon as possible this second phase of the winter campaign, the struggle to cover the rear of Army Group A in order to undertake the final restoration of the position on the southern flank. This last task could only be accomplished by defeating the enemy forces threatening to overrun from the west. We were indeed able to significantly reduce the timing of the withdrawal from the Caucasus. The above-mentioned delays were partly inevitable in the conditions of positional warfare and in the difficult conditions of the mountain theatre, and partly they were caused by the unwillingness of the High Command to voluntarily give up anything. They led to the fact that the Group Don from the end of December to early February was tied up in fighting in the Don area. These long battles could not but exacerbate the danger of cutting off the southern wing of the German army, especially increased in connection with events at the front of Army Group B. Who wants to find an example that confirms the idea that the strategy is a system of ways out of the situation can hardly find anything more exemplary than the fighting of both armies of the Group Don in this period. We were able to cope with all the tasks outlined above, despite many critical moments, only because the command of the Army Group, as well as the command of both armies, always followed the proven principles of the German military. To conduct operations flexibly and maneuverably, to give maximum freedom of initiative and autonomy to commanders of all ranks. But these principles diverged significantly from Hitler's point of view. The first principle will be discussed in connection with the presentation of combat operations of both armies, but about the second I want to say a few words beforehand. A special advantage of the German management of troops has always been that the subordinate commanders were given maximum freedom of independent decisions. They were set tasks, the way to fulfill which they could choose at their discretion. With this principle, German military art, at least since Moltke's time, differed from the military art of most other armies. In these armies, not only were subordinate commanders not given the same freedom in operational and tactical matters, but, moreover, they were given extensive and detailed instructions as to how to accomplish the task at hand, or tactical actions were squeezed into a dead scheme. The Germans considered this method to be harmful. It is true that with such a method, the danger of making a mistake is reduced for the average commander of average ability. But it can easily happen that the executor of the order will be forced to act contrary to the requirements of a particular situation. This method often misses an opportunity for success that could have been seized by the subordinate commander at a decisive moment and in a favourable situation, in favour of the hope of safety. The German system is ultimately due to the peculiarities of the German character, which, contrary to the silly popular phrase about strict discipline, has vivid individual traits and is characterized by a certain propensity for risk, in which perhaps qualities inherited from the ancient Germans are manifested. But the granting of such autonomy to subordinate commanders presupposes that in chiefs of all ranks some basic provisions of tactics and operational art have become flesh and blood. This unity of views has been achieved to the necessary extent only by the school of the German General Staff. But still the responsible superior officer is often faced with the question whether he should not influence the command of the armies subordinate to him. Let's say, the more difficult the situation, the less at his disposal the forces with which he has to make do, the more he will be tempted to interfere in the affairs of his subordinate commanders. But the decisive factor, of course, will be how highly he values his subordinates. As for the command of Army Group Don, I believe that we only directly influenced the command of the armies when it really could not be done without it. This was especially true in those cases when the fulfillment of the operational plan of the Army Group Command was connected with such a responsibility, which we did not consider it possible to transfer to the command of the army that was carrying out the task assigned to us. We were principled opponents of non-binding advice, which means the death of all initiative and is a way of veiling responsibility. It has been shown before that Hitler attached little importance to this justified German principle of troop management, and that he constantly tried to interfere in the activities of his subordinate commanders by giving them private orders. From their implementation could not be evaded when they were related to the actions of neighbouring army groups or contained instructions regarding the use of troops still in reserve. But when Hitler's orders required at all costs to hold a certain line, the circumstances in the end proved to be stronger than he. It was more difficult, however, to overcome Hitler's desire to delay the necessary decision, which was also mentioned above. We could not force him to give the order. In such cases, there was nothing else left but to report that if by such a day or by such an hour will not be received by the oak instruction, we will act at our own discretion. In contrast, the commanders of the armies subordinate to Army Group Don, neither in this campaign nor subsequently, apparently never had reason to complain that we were seeking to delay a necessary decision. If they approached us with a question or a request, they received an immediate answer. It is true that in difficult cases the Army Group Command postponed the decision of the issue for a very short period of time, a few hours or until the next day. On the whole, however, with the exception of Stalingrad, the Army Group Command still always managed to achieve the necessary measures in spite of Hitler's interference and despite his indecision.